There was no rejection of anyone who wanted to go up onto the stage and perform. For the first time, there was a sense of relaxation in the conduct of the cadets. I've kept in my memory forever that last evening at the school, especially its final minutes, when the entire battalion, 600 cadets, rose from their chairs and began singing to the accompaniment of the band, "Arise, enormous country, arise for the fateful battle." I can't forget the day of our departure either. Everything proceeded ceremonially and with enthusiasm. In a column of fours, we marched shoulder to shoulder across the parade ground, giving salute to the school's banners, heading for the gates to leave it forever. For some reason, we had to stand a long time in front of the gates, waiting for them to open. And that's when I saw Zina. She approached the column, spotted me, and without hiding her feelings, came up to me, embraced me, and kissed me firmly. Imperceptibly, she slipped a piece of paper with her address into my hand and whispered, "May God spare you, cadet. Forgive my rudeness. I will be praying for you. When you reach the front, write me." A lump formed in my throat, from surprise, emotion, and tenderness, from recognizing the significance of the moment. Thank you for everything. I will read Stendhal without fail. I remembered, youth is a time of courage. I'll try. My thanks to you. I hugged her. The guys moaned but stayed quiet, for it wasn't the time for ribald banter. I repeat today, thank you, dear Zina. The gates opened wide. Before I left, I turned back once more, looking through the column of students. Zina was nowhere in sight. Once the column had fully entered the street, Fonya couldn't restrain himself and muttered, "Even a beast chases after a woman." The swine. None of the students offered him any support. The column moved along the streets of Tiumen, with a band playing ahead, drums and horns blaring. Almost all the school's officers came to see us off, and some went all the way to the train station with us. Each one wished us to become officers as soon as possible, offering unbelievably warm, sincere, and kind words. At the station, we found the train, with its coach cars waiting for us, ready to depart. We hoped that Lieutenant Artur would come along to the front, that the school would want to rid itself of him, but it didn't happen. He accompanied us to the coach, shook everyone's hand, and wished that we would all become heroes. When the train started moving, the cadets grumbled, "What a snake! They've left him to ruin more new recruits. A man like him shouldn't be allowed to live among people." The first days of May 1942. The train gathered speed. 618 and 19-year-old fellows, a battalion of cadets from the Tiumen Infantry Specialist School, were heading west to battle the enemy. The 9th of May. The third day on the train. We passed through Sverdlovsk and had a 4-hour delay at the station. While we waited, we ate our fill. Whenever someone asked for more, they received it. I sent Mama a telegram. There were many refugees from Moscow at the station. I had a brief chat with a few of them. They had fled Moscow in the alarming days of October 1941, and now weren't allowed to return. People without accommodations, without food, with no knowledge of how to get by, were sending telegrams to the government, but with no effect. Our echelon, troop train, consisted of 25 freight cars, with 25-30 cadets in each. Directly behind the locomotive were the staff car and an open platform car mounting anti-aircraft guns. Another anti-aircraft platform car was at the end of the train. The commissariat and medical station were in the middle of the train. This seemed to be the new standard for military trains, given the fearful experiences of 1941. Back at the school, they gave us all dry rations to last 5 days. We gobbled it all up in 3. The echelon sped toward its destination, stopping only briefly at smaller stations. Everyone kept asking, "What's the rush? Why weren't they letting us finish our full course of training?" Evidently the Germans had delivered a strong blow somewhere, and someone needed our help. Even though we were still green soldiers, for some reason we were regarded as useful for the war effort. The 11th of May, Izhevsk, the 5th day of our journey. The command remained silent about where we were going. It was a military secret. I climbed up onto the pigeon roost, as we called the upper shelf in the freight car that served as our bunks, and lost myself in reminiscences. My mind was full of past images, firmly in place, and they wouldn't fade away any time soon. I thought of the most joyful of my recent memories, Mama's arrival in Tiumen. But why did I persuade her to leave? I mentally thanked the company commander who had given me leave to say goodbye. And there were my meetings with Zena, sometimes bright and happy, sometimes melancholic. How she could laugh! I had felt like shouting, "How wonderful you are!" but had held my tongue, trying to find more elevated words, or had simply mumbled something boring and ordinary. What a jerk I am! Was she really right? Is it true that a soldier on the front lives only a week? From The Pit, a theatrical reference, voices called out, asking me to sing something from before the war. Everyone knew I loved the pre-war songs more than others. I decided to joke, and to the tune of a familiar melody started singing, "Always forward, shoulder to shoulder, we march in relief of Ilyich, Lenin." A few of the guys laughed, while others joined in. I then sang Katyusha and a few more songs, with everyone eagerly joining in. After me, Sasha sang and played his recently returned guitar. These impromptu concerts became a daily tradition up until we reached the front. I wasn't a professional singer, but all the officers at our school recognized me as the best singer there. I must have inherited my voice from my grandfather, my mother's father. He worked as a lithographer and sang in his synagogue's choir in Zhytomyr. Later, he became the synagogue's cantor. Mama spoke of him often. The 12th of May, Agritz, the 6th day of our journey. We had a short delay and spent the day playing cards. Half the conversations were about food and how best to fill one's belly. The rest were about women. In 6 days, we'd had a warm meal only once. Along the way, dry rations were passed to us. Sour kissel, a jelly-like dish, dried bread crusts, a little sugar, dried fish, and makhorki, crude tobacco. The lads smoked almost continuously and cursed the command. In the evening, near nightfall, the guys started swapping stories again. "Why does everyone split their guts laughing at these stories? They're just filthy," I said to Iurka, who was lying next to me on the upper berth. "After hearing them, you just feel worse." "Precisely," Iurka agreed. "So much filth that you can't clean it off. Do as I do, that's their motto. Don't pay them any attention. Let the vulgar people have their laugh." Iurka then asked unexpectedly, "Tell me, do you have your own motto, one that you always strive to follow?" "I do," I replied. "It's do the right thing." "And you?" "Mine is, actions speak louder than words." Here is the text you provided, properly formatted. "That they've shoved us out prematurely and sent us to the front is also a thought, not without sense. For this they will one day build the grandest monument to us, the Tiumen cadets." I was indignant. "I don't understand what you're talking about. You never say what you're really thinking. I believe in victory. I also believe in our eventual return." "Optimist. I envy you. You can't even imagine what's waiting for us." "As if they've given you an announcement," I retorted. "Okay, don't croak about it." But Ulick wouldn't be Ulick if he didn't have a little joke upon parting. "To our meeting in the next world." The 16th of May. We completed our 10th day on our trek. It was night. I couldn't sleep because thoughts were weighing on my mind. Iurka also wasn't sleeping, so we started up a conversation. "It's only been 10 days, and already no one even thinks about the school," I started. "What's there to think about?" Iurka dryly retorted. "This and that, the barracks." "Don't speak about the barracks," Iurka suddenly exclaimed. "It was nothing but a collection of card players and petty thieves. Yet we're going into battle with them. They're going to rob from their own, even the dead." "Iurka, don't be so intolerant. Of course a barracks is a barracks, and no one will argue with that. At home, understandably, it is more comfortable. But at the school, they uncovered your staff capabilities, which you didn't even suspect you had. Let's not argue. The front will judge us. Just know that I am not a military man. I cannot live without freedom of choice. While in the army, what choice is there? Left face, right face, forward. Now the war, that is a completely different business. I'll fight honourably, but you must understand that if the ability to command depends only on the ability to obey, from such an officer you will get only an executive, never a leader. But Iorka, not everyone is capable of becoming a leader. And at the front, I only want for the man next to me to be an experienced fellow, someone who knows his stuff. But according to you, he'll be just an executive. Here you're right. But someone, after all, must take responsibility upon himself and give the orders upon which the outcome of the battle will depend. But Iorka, you're becoming quite the maximalist. The conversation irritated me, but it also led me to reflect upon my time at the school and suggested several positive thoughts about it. I decided to jot them down then and there so I wouldn't forget them. Here is what I wrote. 54. My initial military education, an ode to the barracks, oh, barracks. The first meeting with you didn't bring me happiness. It took more than a day for me to become accustomed to you and learn to appreciate what you became in my life. 132 days we spent under your arches. You united us, urchins, into a migrating flock and helped us bear, as much as you knew how, the burden of your stern life. You made us stronger. You rid us of many youthful illusions. You helped us more easily complete the sharp turn from our previous carefree life to the new, far from sweet army service. You introduced us to adult life. You have made us rougher, more distrustful, and, perhaps, more heartless. This is true, but that's not all. You gave us new comrades. Your brotherhood, oh, barracks, extended us a helping hand and helped us survive. You handed us the field regulation, our first soldier's primer. You tried with all your might to teach us. With you we learned the rudiments of service and the difficult military science. Oh, barracks, we often curse you, and not in vain. You were painful and wretched. We counted days down to the minute when at last we could part from you, when we could forget the stench of male sweat, the unbearable nightly snoring, when we could rid ourselves of the stink of fetid foot wraps, and the off-colour jokes, the nasty anecdotes, the loathsome acts, which went far beyond the limits of decency. They didn't adorn our existence or make us any more fond of you. Yes, barracks, in one voice we were ready to say farewell to you, at any price, even if it meant immediate dispatch to the front, even if it meant a hero's death. But you, barracks, didn't let go of us. You held on to us tenaciously. You taught us and tempered us. Now the order has arrived. In response, you ceremonially graduated us. We're going to the front. We're from the same barracks. These simple words have become our common student's motto. Together we shall go into battle. I'm confident that if my fellow students had read these lines, the majority of them would have agreed with me. No one could dissuade me from them. I myself, to this very day, despite everything, have kept a pleasant memory of those times. Not then or later did I reread what I had written that night on the train. My ode, as were all my travel notes, which I am reproducing here from memory, were shortly later consumed by fire. How this happened, I must still tell you. The 17th of May, the 11th day of travel, Arzamas. We passed through Kanish and Sergach. In both places we stopped only briefly, notes on my way to the front. Discussions of the front subsided. No one showed any more interest in where we were being taken. If one of us tried to start up a conversation on this subject, everyone else tried to avoid it. The nearer we drew to the front, the more frequently people were withdrawing into themselves. We stopped giving voice to our thoughts or inner worries. Likely we didn't want to think about death. It is better to ponder life, as it is easier. The usual raid on a station market occurred. Such raids had already become a regular practice. Barely does the train reduce its speed when the strongest, most agile, most brazen men hop from the cars and storm the women, who are selling goods and food. At first they paid fair prices for the items. When the money ran out, and this happened quite quickly, they switched to bartering, a pair of socks for 20 potatoes, an undershirt for a jar of pickled cucumbers, new clean foot wraps and a piece of soap in exchange for a bottle of milk. The closer we came to central Russia, the more wretched the little station bazaars looked. But the raids continued. Gifts from home went for exchange: mittens, tobacco pouches, needles and thread, handkerchiefs, writing paper, pencils, embroidered towels, or salt, which had been squirreled away from the school's dining hall. When items for trade ran out, the raids took on a brutal character. By deception and force, the students took food from the old women and ran away. The women left standing in mute horror, not understanding how such a thing could happen. On this day, Janechka tried to stop the plunderers. The scandal happened before a stop. 4 of the cadets, having grabbed some empty bags, were making their way toward the car's doors. Janechka blocked their way with his scrawny figure. He stood silently, with his arms crossed over his chest. The group of raiders at first didn't understand what was happening. "Cadet Evlev, don't make a Christ of yourself. We've seen such before." Janechka didn't budge. The train began slowing quickly for the stop. The raiders became enraged. "Get out of the way, Leningrader! Don't get yourself into trouble!" Zhenia didn't react. Then they decided to move him out of the way by force. One of the 4 gave Janechka an uppercut to the chin, causing his teeth to slam together with an audible clack. Janechka didn't react to the blow, but simply stepped away from the doors and said, "Men like you, the people of Leningrad, have crushed like rats. People are dying there from starvation, but they haven't stooped to robbery." In response, crude laughter and cruel words rang out. "Don't try and put us down, you little storyteller." The train came to a stop. 3 of the students, throwing open the doors, took off for the station. One, the one who threw the punch, lingered behind. Janechka lay down on the berth and started to sob. The fellow who remained behind walked up to him and tried to soothe him. "I'm sorry, friend. The devil must have gotten into me. We are, after all, from the same barracks." Usually it was impossible not to recognize Janechka's handsome face, but not now, when it was dissolving into tears. His looks were distorted into an agonizing grimace, his face showing not insult, but the deepest bitterness of suffering. And I thought to myself, such people should live forever, for they rise up to defend good from evil. Yurka, and I went over and took Janechka away with us to where we'd been sitting. We sat down closely together, and he stayed with us. Meanwhile, an ugly event occurred at the little station marketplace. The raiding cadets knocked a frail old woman off her feet. Almost lifelessly, she fell in a swoon to the ground, while 2 of her jugs of spring water, which she had brought from her village, tipped over and rolled off to the side, spilling out their contents. The plunderers almost trampled the woman. It turned out that she considered this water holy, and she was giving free drinks to the Red Army men who were headed for the front on the passing trains. "The Huns," Yurka said later, on account of what happened. Looking away from Janechka, Yurka and I tried to lighten the scene and joked around a little, recalling funny stories from our childhood and school pranks. Janechka, it seemed, was sleeping. Actually, he was lying with his eyes closed and listening to us. Then suddenly he spoke up. "Good heavens, how I envy you, how much you love life. You've probably grown devilishly sick of me. Forgive me. You're bored with my constant preaching and me. I'm not just talking about now, but back in school as well." "Don't say such things, Janechka," I objected. No, don't speak. I know what I am." "Well, you've never once asked me to tell you about the blockade. I'll tell you now. For a month, I worked in a hospital. We fed the wounded crumbs, cooked in boiling water. Nobody grumbled. It was cold October, and we lacked firewood. Dystrophy and scurvy were rampant. Every morning we carried the dead out of the ward. Some people couldn't stand it and lost their minds. Everybody dreamed of food. I did too. Every summer our mother used to take my sister and me to the sea, and I had an unusual dream. It was as if I was in the Crimea, and I'm seeing loads of all kinds of fruit, fragrant peaches and pears, plump grapes. Can you imagine? It was a wonder." He continued. "The Germans bombed Leningrad every day and bombarded it with heavy artillery. But all the same, this wasn't the front. The hospital was located in a building of the Gorny Institute on Vasilevskaya Island. When the patients were falling asleep, I would go into the empty library, and by candlelight I would read. This calmed me, chased away the gloomy thoughts, and filled me with hope. I read only one book, Frahman's Wild Dog Dingo, a popular storybook of that time about comradeship and friendship, intended for older schoolchildren. How did it wind up in the Institute's library? It shook me to the core with its example of pure good regard of one for another. To this day, when I think of it, my spirits become lighter. The 18th of May, the 12th day. The echelon came to a stop in an empty field. Everyone was ordered out of the cars and to fall in beside it. The echelon's chief and commissar appeared in front of us. Looking over the faces of the cadets with a sullen expression, the chief loudly and precisely pronounced just a few words. "Who are you? Soviet officers or marauders? Did you think about whom you were robbing? Mothers whose sons and grandsons are fighting to the death at the front? Remember, whoever commits one more criminal act will be immediately turned over to a military tribunal." Having disdainfully spat on the ground, the echelon chief sharply turned and began to walk quickly back to the staff car. Without having said a word, the commissar followed him. "Back to your places." With lowered heads, the cadets dispersed back to their cars. The echelon didn't stop long, but it was long enough for me to sense a feeling of shame. If only because I hadn't done a thing to stop the incident the day before, and I hadn't said a single word against what the impudent cadets had been doing. Late in the evening, various voices in the car started singing chastushki, 2-line or 4-line folk verses, usually humorous and topical, sung in a lively style. The cadets had gone over to folk tales, which were more decent than the anecdotes. The command had condemned the marauders, but they hadn't called out any of the cadets, nor had they observed or appreciated Janechka's action. Why didn't Shurka force his fraternity to stop their raids? I had considered him an honest fellow. Janechka disclosed the secret to us. It was painful to find out, but Shurka had yielded to temptation. The marauders were sharing their spoils with him. On this occasion, Yurka told us a story. His father had started work as an apprentice at the same factory where his grandfather and great-grandfather worked. This was still before the revolution. One day the grandfather discovered a piece of material for wiping down machine tools in his son's pocket. "What's this? This isn't yours, and yet you carried it away from the factory?" he sternly asked his son. And then he gave his son a beating dot. Did such a watershed event exist for the plundering cadets? At the various stops, women frequently passed down the line of cars, holding up photographs of their sons and daughters, and calling out their family names. Perhaps somewhere you've seen him, her. Time will pass, and then our own mothers will be coming to the trains heading for the front with the same question. The 19th of May. Murom. The 13th day en route. We were given a warm meal today, and it was tasty. At the station I had a chat with some cadets from the Chelyabinsk Armour Specialist School. Their train is apparently following ours along the same route. One cadet tanker, whom I had once coincidentally met in Chelyabinsk, told me that prior to their departure they had all been awarded the rank of senior sergeant and had received their T-34S directly from the factory. Fine. At the school, the guys had trained on just these machines. Terrific. But it wasn't all so simple. It turned out that each tank had its own peculiarities, with the motor, its working parts, or its armament. Thus, it was impossible to tell in advance how a particular tank would operate in battle. Upon arrival at their designated place, they would immediately move out to the front in their tanks, and each would have to familiarize himself with the specifics of his armored vehicle during this time. Yes, everyone had his own problems. That night, Yurka told me about his first loves. He had loved Katya, his classmate. Katya was in love with Ayura. Then, suddenly, the 9th grade Ayura got together with his apartment neighbour Kira, a woman about 15 years older than him. Ayura would visit her whenever her husband, Igor, who drove an electric trolley, was away at work. Kira became the first woman in Ayura's life. Whenever he tried to say something romantic, Kira would interrupt him. "We don't talk about love, my young friend, we just simply love." But alas, secrets are hard to keep. The husband unexpectedly arrived home one day, and a scandal erupted. He beat Kira unmercifully, then tossed her in her nightgown into the common hallway, shouting, "Let our neighbours have a look at a slut!" The next morning, after sobering up, he forgave her, but as for the gymnast, as he called Ayura, he warned, "It will be better if I never lay eyes on him. I'll beat the hell out of him." Soon, Igor and Kira moved to a different apartment building, and the story of Yura plus Kira = love came to an end. Leaving for the front, Yura wrote a letter to Katya and promised, "If I live, we'll be together." But when I asked him, "Will this really happen?" he didn't answer. Life is a strange thing, that's for sure. We're all crazy. The explanation, obviously, is this. We simply don't understand ourselves. What determines our actions? Desire, judgment, the heart? Most likely desire. That is the primary motive of human behavior. But am I right? Listening to the guys' stories about their girlfriends, I began to feel down. Where, oh where, was my girlfriend? In the 7th grade, I read Maupassant. In the 8th, Couperin. In the 9th, Tolstoy. In the 10th, Turgenev. But when encountering a female, I'd get flustered. I didn't recognize hints or even open invitations to become a man. I didn't know how to act in such situations, which is probably why girls didn't find me interesting. The nearer we drew to the front, the more often thoughts about the future filled our minds. It once seemed to be like a colourful flying carpet. This was no longer true. Therefore, we spoke about it less and less often, though we never stopped pondering it. Again and again I thought back on Zena's proposal. It was sincere. She wasn't simply trying to hide me in the rear. My turn would have come eventually, and officers are also killed. Perhaps I had really acted like a fool. It is true that in addition to all the for and against arguments, there was one but, about which most likely Zena wasn't aware, my Jewish nationality. This particular reason said it all. I asked Yurka, "Aren't you afraid of the front?" What can I say? Yes and no. My father taught me. Why fear that which we cannot change? Haven't you ever been afraid? Perhaps not. I'm not counting small incidents. But I have been, twice. Real fear. The first time was at the information office of the prison that was holding my father. They told me there that he had been sentenced to 10 years without the right of correspondence. I already knew that this wording meant execution. I returned home in utter despair, but didn't say anything to my mother. The next day, after standing in line all night, I inquired again about my father. A new prison guard was at the desk and informed me that my father was still being held, and that they had decided to allow us to communicate with him. I continued. The second time I was terrified by wolves. One winter, late in the evening, I was returning to my village from the district centre Shumik in a horse-drawn sleigh with a driver. It was completely dark, but the road, which ran through a forest, was smooth, and the horse was peacefully trotting along a familiar route. The horse was the first to sense danger. It whinnied and bolted. The sleigh jerked so hard that I almost tumbled out, and that's when I saw 3 enormous wolves. They leaped out of the woods behind us, momentarily froze, raised their snouts, gave a terrible howl, and then rushed after us. The driver didn't panic and lose control. Clearly this had happened to him before. He began shouting at me, "Hold on to the handrail tighter. If you don't hang on, you'll fall. The horse won't let us down." I latched on to the handrail. The chase was frantic. The driver was shouting, hang on more tightly." I could already see the wolves' huge, dull, yellow eyes. It seemed like just 4 or 5 more bounds and they would have us. Then the driver suddenly turned and hurled a rope at them. The wolves slowed their chase and began to fall behind, their eyes now looking like distant village lights. Soon we heard the barking of dogs. My fingers were so tightly clenched around the handrail that I couldn't open them, but just imagine what it will be like if it's a tank coming toward you. Yurka, as always, decided to deliberate over the matter. What is fear? Unable to hold back the question that seemed heavy on all our minds, I asked, "Do you believe that we'll ever get back from the war?" "I hope so. Only we'll be completely different men by then." "Then we'll have to meet again after the war. I'd like that very much." "Me too. We'll hold to it." The 21st of May, the 15th day of our journey. Moscow's Ring Road, that must be it. We'd reached Moscow. If only I could visit it, just for an hour. But we didn't stop long. The train moved on toward the northwest. That night, just before dawn, they offloaded us at the Toropets station. We were on Tver land now. That was the answer to our puzzle. It's the Kalinin front for us. Our 2-week journey from Siberia had come to an end. The train, having delivered us, immediately left on a return trip. We were formed up and the column headed towards some woods at a quick step. I noticed that several cadets kept glancing up at the sky. There it was, the first signs of fear, the apprehension that enemy planes might suddenly appear overhead. We halted near the village of Erofevo. The division's origin moor, and more trains arrived, from Moscow, Central Asia, the Urals, from Siberia and Central Russia. There were many other cadets among the passengers. It turned out that we were the lucky ones after all. Cadets from other specialist schools had been delivered to the front after only 2 months of training. The last week or so of May became the first days of the forming of a new division, the 215th Rifle Division. It was formed with the remnants of the 48th Rifle Brigade, which had arrived here before us from around Valige, after experiencing terrible, bloody fighting there. Officers were assigned to us. Most were young fellows, like us, in brand new uniforms. Just a couple of weeks before, they had been cadets too. But now they would lead us. They had been most fortunate, as they had managed to graduate from their schools. The first days at the front. An unbelievable sequence of events had seized us all. A patriotic rush of cadets had blazed up and was burning with new strength. Everything was so new to us. Our first division and our first combat officers, the parting of students from the same barracks, meetings with frontline veterans, the historic story of the 48th Rifle Brigade's defense of Moscow, and our first nights under the stars. We were given waterproof capes that could double as pup tents, a useful acquisition in war. On our first night at the front, everyone slept on the grass, wrapped in their capes and covered by their greatcoats, with their kit bags serving as their pillows. We slept soundly, which spoke of our fatigue, hunger, and the forest air. Everyone had become unaccustomed to oxygen during the 2 weeks on the train. Although the night was chilly, especially just before dawn, we were prohibited from building campfires. Fires were permitted during the day, but only from dry twigs and branches, so that they wouldn't produce any smoke to betray our presence. In the morning, the officers read us our first order. Today, all of us, former cadets, were now soldiers of the 215th Rifle Division of the Kalinin Front's 30th Army. Our army commander was General Dmitry Danilovich Lelyushenko. The front commander was Colonel General Ivan Stepanovich Konev. We were also informed that since we were still located in the second echelon of the front, we would be fed according to the reduced norms for second echelon troops, news we received a little less gladly. The soldier's bulletin reported that the division commander himself would organize the division, but he hadn't yet arrived. Within several days, we were all assigned to our regiments. The division had 3 regiments, the 707th, the 708th, and the 711th Rifle Regiments. We were happy that we had wound up in a new unit. We were proud of the fact that we cadets were being called the primary component of the 215th Rifle Division. Encircled and I decided to request assignment to the same regiment, but we were sent to separate ones. I wound up in the 711th Rifle Regiment, while Encircled was sent to the 707th Regiment. Did we, the soldiers who arrived at the Kalinin front at the end of May 1942, know what kind of combat situation we had entered? Bloody fighting had been continuing here since January, and it had already cost tens of thousands of lives. The press had been quiet about the warfare, modestly calling it battles of local significance. We cleared small areas for the field kitchens. 2 platoons were ordered to lay down a road from the camp to the high road we had followed to the forest. Using their sappers' shovels, they cut branches, laid them down alternately lengthwise and crosswise into 4 layers, and over these layers, in order to compress them, they laid thick logs of identical diameter. Everyone worked in great fervour. Soon after the corduroy road was completed, the long-awaited 1.5-ton trucks and about 3 dozen carts appeared on the high road. They were bringing food, but the column was unable to travel down the several hundred metres to the forest. The oversaturated ground immediately settled deeply, swallowing the log road. The first to get stuck on the disintegrating road were the trucks, loaded to the brim with boxes and heavy sacks. Immediately after them, the carts and horses bogged down. Everyone rushed to help. Some tried to drag the vehicles out of the morass, harnessed in ropes, or put their shoulders to them and tried to push them out. But the truck motors kept dying every now and then. From that day, we christened the 1.5-ton trucks first 5-year plan trucks, recalling the difficulties in getting the planned economy going. Others dragged the carts and horses from the muck, which had sunk up to their bellies in the sticky mud. To lighten the load on the carts and trucks, men hoisted heavy sacks and boxes onto their shoulders, and, in 2s and 3s, barely able to extract their foot after each step, made their way onto firm soil with their burdens. If anyone started to grumble, he was immediately rebuked. "You haven't come to your mother-in-law's for pancakes!" Quite so. Our first frontline assortment of food consisted of cans of American stew, 1 can for 8 soldiers, a large cold smoked fish, to serve 5, and for each 2 sweet biscuits, 3 tablespoons of millet, 2 lumps of sugar, and a tiny handful of salt. A packet of macorca, cheap, inferior tobacco, was to be shared among 3. The soldiers were especially pleased with the tobacco. A Tsar's gift. Newspapers began to rustle, self-rolled cigarettes began to smoke, and someone taught me how to roll a cigarette from a piece of newspaper. The press had been delivered to us before the food arrived. We eagerly began to prepare our meal. We drew water from the ditches with our mess tins. It had already settled after the rain and had become clear, with little withered roots, pieces of bark, and twigs visible on the bottom of the ditch. We fervently opened the cans of stew and ground the biscuits for seasoning. Suddenly, one of the cadets yelled, "Hush! Stop the noise!" It had seemed to him that a German pilot, high in the skies, could catch the sound of our biscuits crunching. Loud laughter erupted. We divided up the stew and biscuit crumbs, then mixed them into the water in our mess tins. I also added a fish head, which was my share of the fish we had divided. Then we turned to the most difficult operation, building a hearth to heat our meal. Many of us had no idea how to do this or where to begin. That's when the old rule that had been taught to us, "Do as I do," proved useful. Everyone followed the example of the old hands. I scraped the bark off 6 thick branches and sharpened their ends. Then I took 2 of the stakes, crossed them, and stuck them firmly into the ground on one side of the fire, then did the same with 2 more stakes. I laid the remaining 2 stakes across them over the fire. It was surprising how much experience and skill were needed for such a seemingly simple task. Everything had to be done with careful thought. The support stakes had to be a certain distance from the fire so they wouldn't catch fire. The cross stake had to be a specific height above the fire for the same reason. It also had to be a little stronger to support the weight of a full mess tin, or else doubled, as it was in my case. I hung both my and Iurka's mess tins over our fire. If you didn't do everything just right, swift retribution would follow. Your mess tin would tilt and spill its contents into the fire, or the entire little structure might collapse. I took all stages of preparing the meal upon myself. Iurka didn't object, especially after I told him that this wasn't my first experience with cooking and that I knew wilderness skills as well as any forester. In reality, this was pure bragging on my part, which became apparent as soon as I tried to start the fire. I couldn't get one going no matter how hard I tried. Iurka was amused but made no effort to intervene in my troubles. Lying on the ground, I tried with all my might to blow tiny embers into a fire, lighting match after match. Then suddenly, I heard behind me an unfamiliar, somewhat mocking voice. "Hey, you're incompetent fellows indeed, cadets." I straightened up and turned around. The company sergeant major was standing beside me. He was strongly built, had slightly greying hair, an open face, and legs slightly curved like a cavalryman's. He had the For Courage medal shining on his field shirt. At that time, not many men had received this soldier's badge of honour. I had already seen this man, who for some reason others addressed not as they should, Comrade Sergeant Major, but instead in a familiar fashion as Uncle Kuzia. The Sergeant Major asked me to step aside, checked the stability of my cooking structure, and within a minute conjured a blazing fire. Having explained how he had done this, Uncle Kuzia expressed his surprise. "How did it happen at your school that you were not taught how to start a fire, even without matches? Where are you from?" Indicating Iurka, I replied. "Cadet Davidov is from the Urals, while I'm from around Moscow. Perhaps you've heard of this place Kuskovo?" "We, brother, are practically neighbours. I lived 3 stations down the line, closer to Moscow from you, near the Hammer and Sickle. Have you heard of it? Next to it is the Chuklinka station, then Karacharova, and then it's your Kuskovo. Right, cadet?" Comfortably settling around the fire, we all sat together for a long while. Kuzia briefly told us his life story. For almost 15 years, he had worked as the deputy head of a children's daycare centre at the Hammer and Sickle factory. "My wife and I are childless, therefore I recognised all the children as my own, and they all called me Grandpa. When the Germans approached Moscow, our factory organised a battalion from its workers. We went into battle with training rifles. Almost all of us are now lying beneath the fields of Borodino, but here I am, still alive." Glancing occasionally at our neighbour, listening to his leisurely speech, I tried to figure out who he reminded me of. For a long time, something about him was nagging me. Then it struck me. He was the living embodiment of Lermontov's Maxim Maximych. The very same look, the very same conscientiousness and trustworthiness. Not an official, but he knew his business perhaps better than any high-ranking officials. We'd only known each other for about an hour, but it was already clear that if all sergeants major were like him, life would be much easier for the soldiers. I pulled my notepad out of my knapsack and began to jot down my impressions. Suddenly, Uncle Kuzia became uneasy, and he cast an alarmed look at me. "What are you writing there, brother? Some sort of novel?" "No, I'm keeping a diary. So many events and interesting people, and I want to write a bit about our meeting as well." Kuzia spoke softly, but almost in the tone of an order. "Get rid of it, brother. Nothing written is permitted in war, whether you're in the ranks or a general. It can lead you to disaster. There are people who keep a sharp eye for such things." Then he added in a now louder voice, "Get this idea out of your head right now. Learn how to fight first, and then you can write about it later. Toss the papers into the fire this very minute, and then give the coals a stir." I felt very miserable for my notes, but Iurka supported the old soldier. "Listen to his sound advice. The sergeant major knows what he's talking about." The next thing I knew, my papers were flying into the fire. Why did I agree to do this? In an instant, my dream of keeping a frontline diary died. It is well known that human memory is a fragile thing. Later, I would regret the sergeant major's help. But as our ancient saying goes, whatever happens, it is all for the best. And quite soon a new idea struck me to write down the advice of frontline soldiers. I immediately thought of the epigraph to the captain's daughter, "Preserve the honour of your youth." I decided that this applied to me as well, since we, the young and inexperienced, need good advice most of all. So I began to listen in on the conversations of soldiers more attentively, and I didn't dally to jot down their aphorisms. By the end of the war, I had compiled a unique booklet, a manual of a soldier's rules of conduct. Later I will talk about it some more. Lunch was ready, and I invited Uncle Kuzia to sample my first frontline cooking. "I'll give it a try," he readily agreed. "Thanks for the invitation." The lunch turned out marvellously, probably because I had added the fish head to the soup, but I must say I had been lucky that it had fallen to my lot. I scooped some soup out of the mess tin, listening to the serene sounds of the forest, and felt, no matter how funny it sounds, a certain affection towards soup. I suddenly recalled how I had been fed in my childhood. For mother, for father, for grandmother, for grandfather, while the child obediently, albeit reluctantly, swallowed the disgusting soup. But today's soup was not just an object of my culinary pride. It was something more significant, a serious step toward independent living. I had to write home about my first frontline lunch. Uncle Kuzia praised my soup, which raised my already high opinion of my own creation even higher. We all spoke a little more, and then we parted. I couldn't even begin to imagine how significant the meeting with this amazing man was for my further frontline life. What didn't he teach us, the young, the cadets and new recruits? He showed us to make better use of a bayonet and a sapper's shovel, and how to start a fire in strong winds or rain. He taught us how to use the tiny undulations of terrain in order to reach the enemy lines more quickly and safely. His advice encompassed so much more, from the sensible way to pack your knapsack to clever and courageous conduct in battle. He also patiently and in detail explained bits of frontline wisdom to us, like, for example, how it was possible even to sleep while on the move, when you're practically falling off your feet during long night marches. 2 soldiers support a 3rd sleeping soldier under each arm and lead him so he doesn't bump into an obstacle or fall into a ditch. Of course, first you must take his gun from him, Kuzia noted, then trade places. There is nothing wiser. Your feet move, while you yourself sleep and your brain gets a rest. Nothing wiser? Then why didn't the infantry specialist school give us such knowledge and experience? In contrast, they taught us how to act according to regulations upon encountering an officer. First, you must await recognition, and only then present yourself. It is deathly important, on the parade ground and on the red calico corridor carpet leading to the commandant's office. Frontline life quickly separated the sergeant major from me, and to the end of the war I didn't learn anything more about him, even whether he had died or was still alive. At the end of 1946, when I had just bid farewell to the army, I one day heard a calm, somewhat muffled voice on the other end of the telephone line. I immediately recognized the voice. Uncle Kuzia. He had looked me up to invite me to a family celebration, his silver wedding anniversary. I attended, where I experienced the joy of reuniting with this astonishingly wise and good man. Somewhere at the end of the 1950s, his wife called me and gave me the sad news. Kuzia had died suddenly of a heart attack. I went to the funeral. I travelled by the electric train up to the Hammer and Sickle station platform just as he had instructed, and along the way I was almost praying. How grateful I was to fate. How often it led me to good people, and they always appeared at a most critical time in my life, as if they had been sent to me by some benevolent spiritual force. Uncle Kuzia was one such gift. How many lives did he save with his wise pieces of advice and his sincere regard for us? I even began to feel sorry for him, and I wanted to help him. But how? We all, devil take it, were in the same harness. For all of us, this was our first day at the front. The young soldier was very agitated, searching for the right words, striving to better explain his torments to us. He looked beseechingly at us. Well then, what should I do? I've laid all my hopes on you. My aunt instructed me, when you reach the front, Mavri, you'll track down a good man. Trust him and tell him everything openly and seek his advice. Here, Iurka said, clapping Mavri on the shoulder. Hold your tongue, soldier, that is my chief advice. Act as you know best. You're not a child anymore, but remember, if you ever fall into the clutches of the fascists, they won't stand on ceremony with you. They'll finish you off quickly, have no doubt. Unexpectedly, Mavri reached for Iurka's arm. What's this? It seemed that he wanted to give Iurka a kiss on the cheek, in the Russian way, but Iurka managed to dodge it in time and gave the appearance that he hadn't noticed anything. Mavri began to tell us about his family. Papa was strict with the family. He used to say, "Work from early childhood, Mavri. Don't whine, you're not a woman. Don't be a windbag. Don't wail over hunger cravings or the cold. Tough it out. A peasant's life isn't honey, but don't betray it. As in our family, it has been passed down through the generations. Stand up for yourself. Live decently. But most importantly, don't forget your faith. Without it, you'll go astray. That sums it up. But in our platoon, we have few Russians, mostly just Turks. Evidently he meant Uzbeks. They stay quiet, or pray to their god and eat raisins. They brought full bags of raisins with them from home, and eat them amongst themselves. But by their own reckoning, they share just 5 little raisins with us each day. They're wicked people. Back in my village, we have a way of dealing with such people. We dunk their heads under the ice. I interrupted his monologue. No, Mavri, none of that. Here you're wrong. It isn't right to dunk people's heads under the ice. Didn't you just notice how your Turks didn't cook the food they were given? They ate it raw, which is probably why they treasure the remnants of their raisins. Perhaps our food isn't suitable for them at all. People are different. They have different faiths. But there is no human without some drop of goodness. Yurka immediately responded, I'm not so sure. What about the German bandit? Mavri asked, Why is their God calling these Muslims to battle? Yurka burst out laughing. How should I know, Mavri? I haven't chatted with them myself, and you're just going to sniff out a good person from among them at a glance? I've been kept busy, and to no real purpose. The Turks don't talk in our language, and I don't understand their language. Then how will the officers instruct them? They'll have interpreters. They'll be useful. This is what I think, said Iorka. At the front, like in the village, life isn't a bowl of cherries, so we'll be fighting according to your father's rules. Don't whine, tough it out, don't betray. In this way, we'll be loyal to our oath. That just may be the truth. You guys are all right. Perhaps we'll meet again. Thanks from the bottom of my heart for the trouble and the company. Mavri stood up. 2 steps, and he disappeared into the night. Yes, things weren't easy for the believers, but for the Uzbeks it was many times more difficult. We had all just spent 1 day at the front, and how many complications there were already. About a half-year later, in the fighting for Rzhev, an amusing incident took place. An Uzbek soldier went missing from his post. He had stood up with his weapon and then just disappeared. Everyone thought he had gone over to the Germans, but the next day, around evening, he came crawling back to our lines, alive and unharmed. In his pocket, he was carrying a note from the Germans in Russian. We don't need such a tongue. Russian parlance for a prisoner willing to talk. We can't understand him, so we're sending him back to you. The night turned out to be warm. Yurka and I were always together, but today's conversations with Uncle Kuzia and Mavri had been a bit prickly. All our thoughts were on the morrow. Understanding that this might be our last philosophical discussion, as we called our conversations, I asked him, What do you think? Will we be going into the front-line trenches soon? What do we know of the enemy? I immediately sensed that Yurka was in a foul mood. You've asked 2 questions. To your first question, that chatterbox Mavri could probably give a better answer than me, because he's often communicating with God. And you yourself know the answer to the second question. As our stinking reciter, the Politruk, instructed us, Germans are fascists, killers, marauders, and Hitlerite executioners. But Yurka, not all Germans can be fascists. They have the largest communist party in Europe. Where have all their communists gone? In my opinion, all their communists are snakes. They've defected to Hitler. Some were afraid, some saw personal advantage, others simply believed their Führer. Have no doubt, in our very first battle, we'll be shooting at former communists too. We've been trained under the slogan, through hatred to victory. But what about the Uzbeks? What do they know about the Germans? Half of them, if not more, are illiterate. What kind of hatred can they have of the Germans? Do they know anything about Germany? You're exaggerating. I think that there are quite a few among them who simply don't want to speak Russian. Yurka fell silent. Through his words, I frankly couldn't recognize him. On this, our conversation ended, though in fact it had never really taken place. The next morning, the soldiers' bulletin announced that 300 cadets from the Kamyshlov Combat Infantry Specialist School and 700 new recruits from Moscow had arrived the previous night. After breakfast, we all were drawn into formation in a large clearing. Before dividing us into separate battalions, the regiment commander made an appeal to the soldiers. "I want to know if there are any hunters, blacksmiths, mechanics, drivers, tailors, cobblers, medical assistants or cooks among you. Step forward, but no tricks." The commander's query naturally caused a general stir in the ranks. Many soldiers stepped forward out of formation, whereupon staff assistants from the regimental headquarters took down their names and skills. Time passed, and noon arrived, but we continued to stand in formation in the field. During this time, as we soon understood, the command was busy making its determinations. Who to the infantry, who to the artillery, who to the sappers, to the medical sanitation battalion, to the armourers, to staff positions, to communications, and all the hunters, to the snipers. From the cadets, 2 separate battalions were formed, a machine gun battalion and an assault rifle battalion, though at that time they had no assault rifles. Later I found out that a Yurka, who was in a different regiment, received a staff position. The regiment's commissar appeared. Evidently we had been waiting for him. He walked along the formation, asking questions of the soldiers. Frequently, without awaiting a reply, he hurried on. A tall, thin officer with one stripe on his shoulder strap was walking behind the commissar. His narrow eyes, raven-black short moustache, and dark-complexioned face allowed one to guess his Eastern origins. He turned out to be the regiment's Komsorg, Komsomol organizer. The Komsomol was the youth wing of the Communist Party, Sabit Kalikov. He was addressing, as a rule, only the cadets. Walking up to me, he asked where I was from, whether I was a Komsomol member, what my education was, and whether I had participated in any social work prior to the army. Then he hurried to catch up with the commissar, exchanged a few words with him, then called me out of the formation and took me with him. Thus, for a short time, I became the regiment Komsorg's assistant. We quickly became friends, and in off-duty hours we would address each other by name. I filed documents and kept the Komsomol dossiers. If the Komsorg was busy, I conducted meetings of the Komsomol committee. I helped the battalion Komsorgs create primary organizations in the companies and batteries. I talked with young soldiers, and if they asked me to do it, I read them articles from the Central and Army press. Within 2 weeks, my Komsomol career came to a sudden end. I accidentally fell under the gaze of the passing regiment party organizer at an awkward time. He was a gloomy man, whom all the political workers in the regiment tried to avoid, aware of his prickly character. It was said that before the war he had headed a party commission in one of the district committees, and when investigating individuals, he recognized only one decision: expulsion from the party. During the years of Stalin's terror, this was often equivalent to a death sentence. My encounter with him occurred under unfavourable conditions for me. I was without my forage cap, wearing an unbuttoned field shirt without a belt, and what seemed to irritate him the most, he caught me while I was preparing my lunch. He stopped short when he caught sight of me, and asked with evident irritation, "Who are you? What are you doing in the political office?" I reported, as I should, "I'm the assistant to the regiment's Komsorg." "Why are you busy fixing food in the political office?" I tried to explain that I had been given dry rations, as they wouldn't let me into the commander's dining room as a private. My reasons, obviously, weren't convincing to him. Shortly thereafter, Kalikov summoned me, and guiltily lowering his eyes, he asked me where I wanted to go, to which unit. By his expression I could tell he had suffered a sharp reprimand, so without asking any questions I requested that he send me to the artillery. I was trained on mortars. "Okay," he replied, "you'll become a gunner." 5. How I searched for the truth and what became of it. June-July 1942. In an artillery battery I was assigned to a gun crew as the number 4 man, that is, as the man who carries the shells from the cases to the gun tube. Our gun was a 45 mm anti-tank gun. My duties were not particularly compelling, but one must start somewhere. Our commander was Senior Sergeant Lenia Loshak. He was 22, a strong man from somewhere near Tambov. He knew his stuff, a high-class professional artilleryman. He related strictly but justly toward his subordinates and treated us all the same. As a result, we all respected him and tried to carry out his every order swiftly and properly. We had 6 men in our gun crew. The most important person was the gun layer, since success or failure rested largely on his shoulders. A tank is a moving target. To hit it requires steely nerves, precise calculations, and the ability to evaluate a situation quickly and accurately. I considered our gun layer, Andriusha Paniushkin, to be something of a wizard. He already had 2 German tank kills to his personal credit. I immediately took a liking to the 45. I tried to find out everything I could about it and to learn the business of artillery. Veteran artillerymen willingly explained the role of the gun in battle. Heavy artillery stands about 3 to 5 kilometers behind the front lines. But we duel with enemy tanks and, importantly, unsuppressed enemy firing positions. We are positioned, as a rule, together with the infantry, just 100–150 meters behind them, and in battle, when the infantry advance, we batterymen roll our guns after them and try to protect the infantry from tanks. In this situation, the battery falls into an unfavorable situation. The riflemen take cover behind any little mound or wrinkle in the ground, while you are rolling your gun forward in the open. The Germans never fail to spot you, and then they flog you with fire. So we have the expression, "The barrel is long, but the life is short." Damn it, the infantry attack, and we're right behind them. The rifle battalion gets to rest at night in new positions, but we get the order. Dig in! Camouflage your positions! The next morning, a preparatory artillery bombardment and battle. When the evening rolls around again, damn it, there is a regrouping. We arrive at a new place at night and again pick up our spades. You get so worn out that nothing matters anymore. With full knowledge of the shortcomings of the 45, it was undergunned in battle with tanks. The soldiers loved it all the same. It was light, just 540 kilograms. If it fell into a shell crater, we could drag it out ourselves. True, it was not easy to carry the shells. A loaded box of shells weighed 50 kilograms, but 2 could manage it well enough. In battle, each 45 shell that hit its target saved soldiers' lives. Meanwhile, the gun's maneuverability and broad steel gun shield, which protected men from bullets and shell fragments, turned out to be invaluable to the artillerymen themselves. In 1943, the Red Army received a new weapon, the 57mm anti-tank gun, a superb weapon. It gradually replaced the 45. After the war, I read that Stalin once told Grabin, the designer of the 76mm anti-tank gun, "Your cannon saved Russia." Unfortunately, such words were never spoken about the 45, though it richly deserved them. Captain Vasily Ivanich commanded our artillery battery. He was an experienced artilleryman who had been awarded the Order of the Red Star for his actions during the fighting for Moscow. The soldiers all called him our Chapai, after the Russian Civil War commander Vasily Ivanovich Chapayev, who was lionized in the 1934 movie Chapayev. Indeed, he himself, though he was 10 years younger, tried to resemble his hero. He grew a moustache just like Chapayev's and tended it carefully. But on his young face, the whiskers looked unnecessary and didn't give him the desired look of the dashing romantic. I liked the way he talked with us, his young warriors. "It is important in battle," said the captain, "to select a good position and to dig in your gun in time. Don't do anything else until you complete this task. The German will fall upon you directly, and you won't be able to cope with him. In order to strike a tank more precisely, you must choose the moment when it turns its side armor to you, even if only for a couple of seconds. The side armor is thinner. If you allow a tank to approach too near, it can pick up its speed and rush your firing position. Even if you penetrate its armor with your shot, it may not stop. Or else one may burst into flames, but you won't have time to stop another. You must make sure the tank catches fire. The battery consisted of 3 platoons, with 3 guns in each platoon. It also had 26 horses. Our battery was located in 2 small villages, not far from each other, and separated by a beautiful little patch of woods and a small stream. After the Germans had retreated from these villages, only 2 or 3 huts and 5 sheds remained intact in each one. The rest had been destroyed. Charred foundations and empty doghouses were all that was left. The inhabitants, only a few remained, primarily old men, women and children, were living in dugouts where they had dragged everything they had managed to save. The peasants told us that when the Germans arrived, they first searched out and executed all the commissars, Communist Party members and Jews, and then they killed all the dogs. In one of the villages, by some miracle, a decent peasant's hut had been preserved, and the battery command occupied it. On the outskirts of the village, closer to the woods, the battery's soldiers stayed in tents. We concealed our guns on the opposite side of the village, in open trenches, and carefully camouflaged them. A little farther, at the edge of some woods, we built stables for the horses and cleared a space for the field kitchen. Our combat supplies occupied a special position, deeply dug into the earth, covered by stout beams. The days passed quickly. We would rise with the sun, spend all day with our arms wrapped around the gun, and then find that it was already night. More than once the battery commander raised an alarm, checking by his watch to see how long it took us to be ready to move out. "Gun crews, to your weapon!" the order would ring out, and in a flash each man would take his proper position by his gun. Although the first attempt was a total mess, soon the battery commander was praising the men of the battery. It seemed that everything was going as it should. I, like everyone else in the battery, received a carbine, a gas mask, 2 first aid packets, and a Red Army booklet, in which the sergeant major wrote down my first combat profession: artilleryman. How proud I was whenever I glanced at this inscription. We were fed according to the norms for second echelon troops, but the food turned out to be tolerable. The cook often added a little something from the forest's bounties, thanks to the efforts of the sergeant major, Osip Osipovich. From morning to evening our officers kept us busy. 5 times a week the battery limbered its guns and moved out for training. We would select suitable positions, a primary position and several reserve positions, deploy our guns, and about 600-700 meters away, we would set up plywood tank dummies, after which we would go through the motions of firing on them. Sometimes we were allowed to fire 1 shell of live ammunition at them, just try to hit a moving target with 1 shot. We often did target shooting with our carbines, which proved to be more difficult than shooting rifles. The carbines had a strong recoil action, but we soon got accustomed to this. It was harder to get used to the night sentry duty. Just as back at the school, we were not freed from the next day's exercises after pulling sentry duty the night before. The constant labour to build firing positions turned out to be even more difficult than night guard duty. How much earth did we dig up and dig up again? For hours we would not let go of a pickaxe or shovel. We dug until we were wiped out. Then our commander, Lenia Loshak, would tell us, "If you don't manage to dig in your gun or yourselves, it will be your death." So we would keep digging. Our gun crew occupied a separate tent. We had among us frontline veterans, new recruits and 2 cadets, but we never had any terrible experiences, like the practice of dedovshchina, where older soldiers haze or beat new recruits while the officers look the other way. In the evenings, we would sit in front of the tent and settle any disputes, or have a life talk, as the Ukrainians say. We joked and smoked hand-rolled cigarettes. We found an accordionist among us who had brought his instrument along with him from civilian life. Before the war, he had been a horse groomer on a sovkhoz, state farm, but in the battery he worked as a team driver. Whenever we were given a free minute, I liked to question the veteran frontline soldiers. One soldier, who had passed through the terrible year of 1941, told me, "When the German advances on you, he harasses you with cannons and machine guns. He's trying to suppress you and your weapon. And what are you supposed to do? Try to knock him out. You won't take him with a grenade. You must absolutely see to it that he blazes up. Everyone will tell you this." I asked, "But if it is a combined arms attack?" A dreadful business. In this case, the Germans, for the most part, try to play on your psyche. They love to fire on the move, both the tanks and the accompanying infantry. You get little real benefit from such fire, everybody knows this, but it works on the mind, especially on those of new recruits who haven't been under fire before. I myself more than once gave way. If you haven't managed to knock out or burn an advancing tank, it is better to let it pass over you, taking cover in the bottom of your entrenchment, then fire and fire as much as you can and however you can, if only to hold up the following infantry and motorized infantry. The most colourful figure in our battery was the Sergeant Major, Osip Osipovich, who was called both yours and ours. The soldiers perceptively noted the character of every officer, be he a sergeant major, a platoon leader, or even the regiment commander. Everyone knew about Osip Osipovich. He was a resourceful fellow who behaved decently with the rank and file, but never forgot about the interests of the command. Osipovich loved to talk, and he often gave us long speeches. He would always say approximately the following: "Who is the sergeant major? The sergeant major is the tail of the army. And what is the army's rear? Logistic support. It is the basis of the army's existence and the main condition for victory. Without the rear you cannot feed a soldier nor warm his soul with a little shot of vodka. Nor can you clean him while he's in the bathhouse, which means you can't free him from lice. Without the rear, no tank will move into battle, no airplane can take off, and not a single gun can fire. Not a single general will receive the woman he wants. Have you noted, artillerymen, the significance of the sergeant major? We'll consider that you have. So I will ask you to love and be gracious toward Osip Osipovich and carry out all my orders precisely." Osip Osipovich was my third sergeant major. How many more I would have? It is bad when a sergeant major doesn't have any sense, culture, or education, which often happens. But one can tolerate this. It is 3 times as bad when a sergeant major doesn't have any trace of ordinary human feelings. The most difficult case, and here you can do nothing about it, is when the sergeant major is an egomaniac, when he is absolutely certain of his superiority over the rank and file. Osip Osipovich was made of different stuff. He was always ready to help the common soldier. And he cared so much for the horses. Even if you woke him in the middle of the night, he could smoothly reel off the names of all the horses and the colour of each one's coat. He took care of the officers. In return, they let him look out for his own interests. But the main thing was that he never forgot about the soldier. Tell me then, how is it possible not to respect such a man, or not to forgive any of his little sins? He was an ideal sergeant major. However, quite soon the life of the battery sharply changed for the worse, and the soldiers knocked their ideal sergeant major off his pedestal. The first thing to deteriorate was the food. Instead of receiving the cans of American stew, we began to be fed garbage. For those who haven't eaten such stuff, I'll explain. It was merely a little hot water, seasoned with groats, a little bit of herbs, and salt. The stew, just like an apparition, had disappeared from our rations. Were the July downpours of rain bogging down the supply line, or had our allies stopped sending it? All sorts of things come into the head of a person in such a situation. If some sort of absurdity occurs, he tries first of all to find an explanation. After the disappearance of the stew, it was the bread's turn. The slices became thinner. Then sugar also began to dwindle, and we received our ration of it only every other day. What was going on? New doubts arose. The officers began to stay away from our drills, handing this duty over to the sergeants. We went out for field training less often. Was it again the fault of the rain? The commissar also forgot about us. They stopped delivering newspapers, so we didn't know what was happening in the country or at the front. Moreover, we were deprived of the paper for our hand-rolled cigarettes. Then something genuinely mean and rotten occurred. Our horses' supplies were reduced. Their daily ration of oats was cut to the barest minimum. Men became noticeably thinner, as did the animals, which we all adored, and which, unlike us, were not capable of finding any supplemental food for themselves. 2 weeks passed under the new half-starving regime. Everyone began to tighten up their belts and make accommodations. I, for example, gave up nearly half my rations to those who agreed to take my place for nighttime sentry duty. Soon we became totally stunned. Instead of putting the horses to harness, they put us there. We had to drag our guns to the training grounds by our own efforts, for there was no other way to get them there because of the heavy rains. We understood that in a combat situation things might be even worse, and we might have to drag the guns ourselves. But what was the point of doing it now? However, there was a reason. The horses were too weak. Artillery horses need no less than 6 kilograms of oats each day, and they weren't getting that. Things also became rather bad with coarse fodder like hay and straw. Where were they to get some? The famished horses, which were not receiving proper care, began to pick at each other's tails and gnaw at manure, and this, God forbid, could lead to great misfortune. A French cavalryman once spoke about such a situation admirably. To a reproach from Marshal Murat, he replied, "People can go without bread, but horses without oats are not in condition to do anything. Love for the fatherland won't keep them going." To drag a gun through wet clay soil, particularly when it is raining, is not a pleasant exercise. Moreover, as soon as you reach the training field, worn out and wet, and select a position, without any pause for rest, orders ring out. "Tanks from the front! Tanks from the rear! Tanks from the flank!" Just try to have time to grasp the order, turn the gun, change the aim, and drag up shells. On an empty stomach, what sort of gunnery practice is that? We collapse, exhausted, one after the other, to the ground. We're all filthy, wet, and what is more, hungry and angry. Having finished our training, we roll the guns back again. We finally reach our encampment, but the platoon leader or sergeant keeps us in formation for another quarter hour while he analyses today's training, just as he should. Then we fall in and march in formation to the field kitchen. But there we find waiting for us only gruel and watery soup without any meat and a mug of semi-sweet tea. It's the same thing every blessed day. It's a good thing that the cook is a decent man, that he asks who wants a little more and never spares another scoop.